Most people assume that ignoring someone is a sign of weakness. They think silence means you've conceded the argument. They think walking away means you had nothing worth saying. And because of this assumption, people feel compelled to defend themselves. They feel the urge to respond. They feel the need to prove their position. But this instinct sets one of the most common psychological traps in human interaction. The instant you react emotionally, you give up control of the situation. Because the person who provoked you was never actually searching for the truth. They were searching for a reaction, a raised voice, an angry reply, a defensive justification, anything that confirms they successfully got inside your head. Most people never consider that provocation is a psychological fishing hook. The words are simply the bait. The true goal is to drag you into emotional engagement. And the moment you take the bait, everything shifts. You are no longer watching the situation from the outside. You are caught up inside it. You are justifying yourself, explaining yourself, responding to every move they make. Meanwhile, the other person is quietly observing something very telling, how effortlessly they can manipulate your emotional state. This is precisely why the person who reacts first tends to lose, because reacting transfers power. It signals to the other person that they have access to your inner world. But centuries ago, Niccolò Machiavelli noticed something entirely different about human behavior. He recognized that power in social dynamics rarely comes from aggression, volume, or argumentation. It comes from control over attention and emotion. And sometimes the most powerful move is not confrontation. It is strategic silence. When you choose not to react, when you stay composed, when you deny someone the response they were expecting, something unexpected begins to unfold. The person who attempted to provoke you starts losing grip on their own emotions, not because you attacked them, not because you won an argument, but because you refused to play the psychological game they designed. Silence does something deeply unsettling to the human mind. It generates uncertainty, and uncertainty destabilizes people far more effectively than confrontation ever could. In this video, we are going to break down 7 deep psychological mechanisms inspired by Machiavellian thinking that explain why strategically ignoring someone can completely flip the power dynamic in an interaction. You will come to understand why silence can frustrate manipulators, unsettle provocateurs, and quietly return authority to your hands. Because sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is not the loudest one. It is the one who cannot be emotionally dragged into the conflict. Before we begin, I want you to drop this affirmation in the comments. Silence is power. Let's dive in. Number 1. The psychological mirror break. Human beings are constantly searching for signs that they exist in other people's minds. Every comment, every insult, every subtle challenge carries an invisible expectation behind it. A reaction. That reaction works like a mirror. When someone provokes you and you respond with anger, they instantly receive proof that their words landed. When you defend yourself, they receive confirmation that their opinion carries weight. When you argue back, they see that they have successfully entered your mental space. In other words, your response reflects their influence back to them. This is why provocateurs often watch your face more closely than they listen to your words. They are not simply speaking, they are measuring impact. But the moment you refuse to react, something unusual occurs within the psychological structure of the interaction. The mirror shatters. Suddenly, the person who expected to see their influence reflected back sees nothing. No anger, no defense, no visible emotional disruption. At first, this silence baffles them. Instead, they encounter emptiness, and the human mind is profoundly uncomfortable with absence where it expected impact. The brain immediately scrambles for explanations. Did they ignore me on purpose? Did they not hear me? Are they stronger than I assumed? Did I misjudge this person? Uncertainty begins replacing confidence. Just moments before, they believed they understood the dynamic between you. They believed they had emotional access to you. But without the mirror of your reaction, their sense of control crumbles. This is where the psychological fracture begins to take shape. People depend heavily on feedback to gauge their influence over others. A leader looks for signs of attention. A critic looks for signs of defensiveness. A provocateur looks for signs of irritation. When none of those signals appear, the brain loses its measuring system. Imagine speaking into a room where every sound you make produces no echo. At first it feels strange. After a moment it becomes deeply unsettling. That is exactly what psychological silence does to someone attempting to provoke you. The absence of reaction forces them to confront a possibility they never prepared for. They may not matter in your mental world. And that realization destabilizes many people far more than confrontation ever could. Confrontation at least acknowledges someone's presence. Silence quietly erases it. This is why experienced strategists rarely rush to respond to every attack or insult. They understand that attention itself is a form of currency. Every reaction you give invests emotional energy into the interaction. Every defense confirms that the other person successfully captured your focus. But silence withdraws that investment entirely. The provocateur is left speaking into an empty psychological space. And empty space has a powerful effect on human perception. It amplifies doubt. The person begins replaying the moment over and over in their mind, searching for clues about what went wrong. They may try again with sharper words. They may raise their voice, restore the mirror they lost. Instead, they begin exposing their own hunger for validation. Meanwhile, you remain composed, emotionally grounded, and psychologically removed. This contrast creates an invisible shift in perception for anyone watching the interaction. One person appears steady and unmoved. The other appears increasingly desperate for a response. And that contrast quietly reshapes the power dynamic without a single argument being spoken. Machiavelli once said, "He who controls himself controls the field of power." True influence often comes not from what you say, but from what you choose not to react to. When someone cannot see their influence reflected in you, they are forced to confront something far more uncomfortable than resistance. They confront irrelevance. And very few people can handle that feeling without losing their composure. Now I want you to drop this affirmation in the comments. I control my reactions. Number 2, status ambiguity. Every interaction between two people contains a silent calculation that most individuals never consciously notice. Beneath the words, beneath the tone, beneath the visible behavior, the human brain is continuously evaluating one central question. Who holds the stronger psychological position here? This evaluation happens automatically. It plays out in business meetings, casual conversations, disagreements, and even simple social exchanges. People measure confidence, emotional stability, and responsiveness in order to figure out where everyone stands in the invisible hierarchy of the moment. The strange thing is that most people reveal their position without realizing it. When someone insults them and they rush to defend themselves, they unintentionally signal that the other person's opinion holds weight. When they react with anger, they reveal emotional investment. When they repeatedly explain themselves, they communicate that the accusation has taken hold deeply enough to require correction. These reactions appear ordinary on the surface, but psychologically they hand the other person valuable information. They reveal that the provocation successfully created engagement. Engagement confirms that the interaction matters to you, and once it matters to you, the other person knows they have influence over your emotional attention. But something entirely different occurs when you respond with calm indifference or deliberate silence. Rather than confirming the hierarchy, you introduce uncertainty into it. The other person cannot easily determine why you chose not to respond. Did you stay quiet because you felt outmatched? Or did you stay quiet because the interaction was simply beneath your concern? The mind immediately tries to resolve this question, but the absence of clear signals prevents an easy answer. This produces what psychologists often describe as status ambiguity. The hierarchy of the interaction becomes unclear, and human beings strongly dislike unclear hierarchies because the brain naturally seeks stability and social structure. When people cannot determine their position relative to someone else, they begin working to restore clarity. This is why individuals often escalate their behavior when they are ignored. They repeat their criticism, they use sharper language. They try humor, sarcasm, or public pressure. Each attempt is an unconscious effort to provoke a reaction that will finally reveal your position. But every failed attempt only deepens the ambiguity. The person expected a quick emotional signal that would confirm their dominance in the moment. Instead, they encounter composure and distance. And that composure quietly transforms how the interaction is perceived. Your silence, avoiding engagement out of weakness, but simply choosing not to participate in it. That possibility begins to shape how onlookers perceive the dynamic as well. Observers rarely analyze situations in depth. They rely on visible cues. When they see someone pushing aggressively for a reaction while the other person remains calm and unaffected, they instinctively begin questioning who actually holds the stronger position. The person who appears desperate for acknowledgement slowly loses credibility, while the silent individual appears controlled and emotionally disciplined. None of this requires direct confrontation or verbal dominance. It happens quietly through the management of expectation. Most provocateurs expect predictable responses: anger, defensiveness, or argument. When those patterns fail to materialize, the structure of the interaction becomes unstable for them. They push harder to resolve the uncertainty, but each additional attempt makes their effort more visible. Meanwhile, your position remains undefined, and that undefined status becomes its own form of psychological leverage. Machiavelli once said, "Men judge more by the eye than by the hand, for everyone can see, but few can truly perceive." In other words, perception often outweighs explanation. When you remain composed while others struggle to provoke you, people read that composure as a sign of internal authority. And authority rarely needs to announce itself loudly. It reveals itself through restraint. Status ambiguity functions because the human mind instinctively tries to organize people into clear levels of influence. When someone cannot determine your level, they begin adjusting their own behavior in an attempt to solve the puzzle. But the harder they push, the more their own position begins to slip. In the end, the individual who stayed silent never had to argue for respect. The silence itself compelled others to reconsider the hierarchy. Drop this affirmation in the comments. My silence commands respect. Number 3. The invisible wall. Most people believe strength is demonstrated through confrontation. They assume authority means speaking louder, pushing harder, and defending their position until the other person gives in. In many situations, this instinct feels entirely natural because it appears active and decisive. But confrontation also creates something very predictable, a visible battlefield. The moment you begin arguing, both sides clearly understand the structure of the interaction. There are attacks and defenses, accusations and counter-arguments, pressure and response. Every move invites the next. The conflict becomes a structured game that both participants recognize. And once you step into that structure, you are no longer shaping the environment. You are functioning inside it. But strategic silence introduces something completely different. Instead of visible resistance, the other person encounters something they cannot clearly identify. Imagine someone pushing against a door, fully expecting it to open, only to find that it does not budge. They push harder, still nothing happens. They try again with greater force, yet the door remains completely still. Eventually, frustration replaces confidence because the expected result never comes. Psychologically, ignoring provocation operates in a similar way. Rather than giving the other person an argument to engage with, you present an invisible barrier. They push with criticism, no emotional response. They push with sarcasm, still nothing. They try embarrassment or social pressure, yet the calm silence holds. At first, this absence of engagement confuses the person attempting to provoke you. They expected resistance. They expected an exchange. But instead, they find something they cannot interact with. The human brain depends on feedback to navigate social situations. Without feedback, it struggles to make sense of what is happening. This is why the invisible wall becomes increasingly frustrating the longer it stays in place. The provocateur begins escalating their behavior in an effort to break through. Their voice may grow louder, their language may sharpen, their emotional tone may intensify. But every escalation only reveals something important. They are now working harder than you are. This reversal shifts the emotional weight of the situation. The person demanding engagement begins to appear unstable, while the silent individual appears grounded and composed. What makes the invisible wall so effective is that it removes the reward provocateurs are seeking. Many people provoke others because the reaction itself is the prize. It confirms that they successfully affected someone. It delivers emotional stimulation and attention. But when their words meet silence, that reward disappears entirely. Instead of excitement, they experience irritation. Instead of satisfaction, they encounter confusion. Over time, the absence of a response becomes more uncomfortable than any argument could have been, and this discomfort begins influencing their behavior in ways they did not expect. Some individuals eventually abandon the interaction altogether because the invisible wall makes the effort feel futile. Others become visibly frustrated because they cannot force the reaction they were counting on. Either way, the dynamic shifts quietly in your favor. You did not need to raise your voice. You did not need to defend yourself. The absence of reaction built the barrier that protected your psychological position. Machiavelli once said, "The wise man does at once what the fool does finally." In many confrontations, the fool reacts immediately while the strategist observes patiently. Silence can feel passive to those who equate power with aggression. But controlled silence is not passivity, it is deliberate restraint. It is the capacity to recognize when engaging would only reinforce the other person's position. The invisible wall teaches something essential about social influence. Not every challenge deserves participation. Some situations gain their power only when you step into them. By refusing to engage, you cut off the oxygen the conflict needs to survive. The other person may press repeatedly, searching for an opening in your composure. But if the wall holds firm, their effort eventually exposes itself as unnecessary noise. And when people realize they are pushing against something that refuses to yield, they often burn through their own emotional energy long before they touch yours. I want you to drop this affirmation in the comments. Calm is my shield. Number 4. Delayed psychological gravity. Most confrontations follow a pattern that feels almost automatic. Someone says something provocative. The other person reacts right away. Words are exchanged, emotions escalate, and eventually the interaction arrives at some form of resolution. It might end with someone walking away, a temporary compromise, or simple exhaustion. But the key element in this pattern is speed. The reaction happens quickly, and that speed allows the mind to resolve the moment almost immediately. Even if the exchange was uncomfortable, the brain processes it as finished and moves on. This is precisely why many provocateurs expect an immediate response. Quick reactions produce quick endings, but silence disrupts this entire psychological sequence. When you refuse to respond, the natural cycle of provocation and reaction suddenly breaks down. The interaction never reaches closure. Instead, it remains unfinished, and the human mind struggles profoundly with unfinished things. Psychologists often describe this as a mental loop. When something stays unresolved, the brain keeps returning to it, searching for meaning or explanation. Silence creates that loop. The person who expected a reaction now finds themselves carrying an unanswered moment around inside their mind. They replay what they said. They imagine different interpretations of your silence. They begin doubting their own assumptions. Did they ignore me intentionally? Did I misread their reaction? Should I have said something different? Each time the mind revisits the situation, the emotional weight of the moment grows slightly heavier. What originally lasted only seconds now occupies far more mental space than it ever would have if you had responded immediately. This is where delayed psychological gravity begins to take hold. Think of gravity as a force that steadily pulls objects toward a center. In social interaction, unresolved silence operates in much the same way. The longer the silence persists, the more attention it draws inside the other person's mind. The brain naturally strains to complete unfinished experiences. Without closure, the moment lingers like an unanswered question. Ironically, the person who tried to provoke you may end up thinking about the situation far more than you ever did. Rather than moving forward with their day, their thoughts keep circling back to the silence they encountered. The longer this delay stretches, the more the meaning of your silence expands inside their imagination. People tend to fill unanswered spaces with their own interpretations. Some begin to assume you ignored them because you regard them as insignificant. Others suspect you understood the provocation, but chose not to engage because you occupy a stronger psychological position. Some even begin to worry that their behavior appeared foolish or unnecessary to those around them. None of these conclusions require you to say a single word. The silence itself allows their own mind to generate the narrative. This is why delayed psychological gravity can quietly reverse the emotional weight of an interaction. What began as a quick attempt to provoke you slowly becomes a lingering question lodged in their thoughts. Instead of controlling the moment, they become trapped analyzing it. Instead of affecting your emotions, they end up wrestling with their own uncertainty. Machiavelli once said, "Men are driven more by the fear of uncertainty than by the certainty of loss." Uncertainty holds a unique,